the universe. And I think that's the single most important foundation of science. And the corollary to that is observation trumps theory. And what that means for an idea like methodological naturalism is that unless you can establish it by observation, the observation trumps that theory. And in fact, going further than that, that one has to be continually open to the idea that maybe observation hasn't established methodological naturalism as an absolute principle. And so, while I think it's a kind of a general rule that's not bad, rule of thumb, if you want to call it that, when we first hear a phenomenon, we don't think of supernatural events to begin with. I think that at a certain point, when one has a real value of natural causes, when we start to think that maybe this is an area where the supernatural has intervened. And if you have a man's body that disappeared, and everybody says they've seen him walking around and talking, and it's really them, then at some point it starts to be reasonable to say maybe he was resurrected.
It's fascinating to hear this from you. I'll use an example. I'll just say at the outset, from the way I understand materialistic naturalism, I'm very thankful for it. In your world, if the product will come onto the market, it will not be based on exceptionally based on testimonials. In fact, there are testimonials on both sides. Presentation. People are defining this term in the way that they can criticize it. And it's most hard-nosed. Courteous, you will discriminate between a drug that's effective enough to risk using it in the human population because it's extremely hard-nosed. Testimonials mean nothing. Another definition out of the gaps. Out of the gaps only is a reality if you believe that if you understand it, God didn't do it. That's crucial. And both sides create, these definitions in order to be able to use them. In my world as a practicing science, this methodological naturalism, or materialistic naturalism, if you will, is extremely useful in trying to get good information published. And I think in understanding that if you can't come to a clearly supportable objective conclusion based on your data, you stepped outside of methodological naturalism. Using a limited view of methodological naturalism, you have to go beyond it. Your deal.
One of the things that I'm thinking of is, there are various things that have been found, in Permian material, dinosaur bones that have apparent actual tissue still in them after supposedly millions of years. And those items have been judged by various biological and chemical criteria. And the criteria that are, the laboratory procedures assume that God isn't filling us in our labs. And so in one sense, they're being judged by methodological naturalistic criteria. On another level, you can say that we can test and see how long biological materials should last, and there's no reason to believe that they should last millions of years, let alone 65 billion years. Same thing is true for carbon-14, for example. And if it's there, but it's not supposed to be there, and both of those conclusions are reached by a procedure that allows methodological naturalism, then you have a conundrum. And the easy way to solve that conundrum is to simply say, well, maybe it isn't as old as it's cracked up to be. And so I see, methodological naturalism as something that is reasonable to assume as far as you can, but I think that there does come a breaking point. And when we get that breaking point, we should acknowledge it rather than trying to fight harder and harder. I think that the origin of life, for example, the field is just horribly confused. There's really no good theory of the origin of life at this point. I don't think there's anybody who makes sense. There's actually a positive that for anybody who is using a really hard-nosed version of methodological naturalism, they would be willing to say, the evidence I only goes so far, I've got to step beyond this to put it in a context that makes sense in whatever picture they're building. I think that's honesty. Yeah. If you're defining science as coexistent with methodological naturalism, then what that's saying is that some evidence invites you to step outside of science. And that's legitimate. What I don't see is to say, but science is the only way to find truth. Methodological naturalism is inherent to science, and therefore a creationist, intelligent design, any idea that there's a supernatural gets to be ruled out before we even start. I think that's a very core philosophical procedure. But that's only valid if you define methodological naturalism in this very broad mechanism. In other words, they're stepping beyond the evidence to make a statement either way. Yeah.
It occurs to me that while this discussion is dealing with intelligent design, it doesn't really, it also sounds as if it's trying to all intelligence. But that would rule out the entire forensic science. What which is specifically geared and oriented to working out who and how is it done and who's responsible and questions of that nature, all of which we still consider very scientific. So why is it that in that context intelligence is admissible, but in other contexts, which we know far less about, it is not? It begins to be a bit of a puzzle. It's as if here's the really big conundrum. When you think about the little bit of information available on the basis of which some forensic conclusions are drawn with a great deal of confidence, and compare that the amount of information that is stored in the DNA of every cell's nucleus, and ask the question, that amount, that volume of information, that sheer quantity of information, get there, and still speak of intelligence here and zero intelligence here, and consider oneself serious in this contemplation. I find this practically preposterous. It's as if one has to be a politician and not a scientist at all to be entertaining these kinds of concepts at the same time.
Here, but right here, I'm thinking of what we have been discussing about today, about the methodological naturalism. We're not trying to define what the scientific method means. I think that we all have summarized and agreed that the forensic science proof that the scientific method is not scientific. That's what I think. Well, yes, forensic science proof that the scientific method is not scientific. Certainly not scientific in that sense. Let me say that one more time. The forensic science proves that the scientific method is not scientific. What I would rather say is that the forensic science proves that the way people use methodological naturalism is not really valid. Because once you allow intelligence into some part of science, and I think forensic science is in fact science, then what it suggests is that naturalistic as opposed to intelligent causes cannot be the major dividing line. In fact, if I were to have to propose a criterion for science, I would say it is the study of the reproducible, and that allows for if a theological proposition can be shown to be reproducible, then what you have at that point is actually theology can be a science. Just a minute, we'll give it to you again. A lot of things are not repeatable. They're observable but not repeatable. So this is where forensic science is important.
That's the example of basketball would be a wonderful thing. As a counterexample to your argument, is how do you produce the same game the same way? There's zero chance of that happening. Okay?
Creation is not repeatable. Yeah, creation is not repeatable. However, even with the event of Krakatoa, some of the things. Yeah. However, if you can see creation that is the same general type of phenomenon that is repeated in the then I think you can't say that if creation is repeatable. I think that when Ellen White talks about the science of salvation, that she's not being facetious, that she actually is talking about if certain things happen, you surrender your life to God, or somebody else does, that there's something that happens that is reproducible in general outline. Just like if we drop things off of the table, maybe one ball and maybe another ball and maybe a third ball with a different density, they will follow similar directions as they fall off of the table. It's a physics experiment that you can do, and you will find that as long as the ball's rate ratio to their resistance is small enough, that they will follow a very similar pattern. And that, of course, leads you to a natural understanding of acceleration and a law of gravitational attraction. If you repeat it on top of Mount Everest, they won't fall quite as fast, and you can actually measure that. But they will still fall, and they'll be pretty close. If you repeat it in various areas, you will find that there's slight variation. If you're near a mountain and so forth, they fall at a slightly different angle and so forth. But all of that it is close enough that you can establish a kind of a general law. And if you go to the moon, which we've now done, and watch and see that the falling happens, but it happens at a different rate, and it's predictable upon the mass of the moon and the diameter of the moon, using science at that point, and even though it isn't precisely reproducible, it's close enough reproducible to where it's reasonable to call it science. And for that reason, even though forensic science is perhaps not precisely reproducible in that way, there is an underlying scientific pattern to it. methodological naturalism, in essence, is simply if it's a rule of thumb, it's a rule saying let's ignore God inside of our laboratories, which I think is fair. If it's an absolute rule for every event in the universe, then it becomes philosophical naturalism. In fact, if not in definition. And philosophical naturalism is simply the attempt to, methodological naturalism is, if it's adopted as an absolute rule, it's basically saying, if you do science, you must make atheists comfortable.
So the problem with the definition of science, we inculcated into our children in this classroom to say that that is the only science, that the definition of the scientific method should be revisited.
Yeah, well, the definition that was taught way back when, and that I think still has merit, is you make a hypothesis, you say what your hypothesis predicts, you go out and you test it, and then you revise your hypothesis depending on what the tests are, or maybe even throw it out, depending on how bad it is. And I think that's the strength of science. It's not that we use methodological naturalism, per se. And what's happened is that the strength of science has been kind of, if I can put it that way, hijacked to serve the purposes of excluding God from nature entirely. And I think that's wrong. Yes?
It seems to me the suggestion of methodological naturalism that it's whatever you can observe and so on. Of course, we know it's not followed, but the idea tends to prevail to a certain extent. And you can ask the question, is that not an arbitrary level at which you define science? You could redefine science and you accept only that which you can smell. And that would be an example of arbitrary definition. And I would say that methodological, you do the line at a certain point which tends to exclude God. Nothing says that there's not truth beyond that. So that it is a somewhat of an arbitrary line. It's a convenient one that gets rid of God. But it's certainly no criteria for finding truth.
Well, if God exists, and you say we're going to deal with something that doesn't include God, and obviously you're not dealing with all of reality. Of course, scientism kind of likes to say that science is all there is, or at least all that is important that there is. Yes?
As a non-scientist, I am having a new enlightenment about methodological naturalism today. It seems to me that all this business about the God of the gaps and how that's such a bad thing, God of the gap, methodological naturalism is just the flip side of that. I mean, whenever you come up against a thing that you don't understand, you just plug in your theory, and it's exactly the same thing. And how can these two sides criticize each other? I don't understand that.
Well, sometimes that's been referred to as the evolution of the gaps, which says if you can't explain it on an evolutionary basis, well, just wait, it'll get here. And really that's basically the flip side of the God of the gaps. The question is, if you don't have all the evidence available, then are you going to assume that some God did it, or are you going to assume that there's some natural process that can explain it? And these people will say, well, you should assume that there's some natural process that can explain it. And that only works if either you know God doesn't exist, or you know God wouldn't do that. And, knowing God doesn't exist is a bit of a stretch. And knowing that God wouldn't do that, in my opinion, is even more of a stretch, especially when most of the people who do this would admit that Jesus was resurrected, so God does step into history. So why can't he step into prehistory? Yeah.
Whenever there is some kind of interaction between unequals, there is always lots of opportunity for plenty of misunderstanding and misconstruing and misinterpretation and such like. The Old Testament is rife with it. When Israelites were going through the desert, they had the pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night. And yet they clamored at Moses as if it was Moses' fault that whatever happened. They had repeated uprisings against Moses, as if he's the one who's guiding the pillar of cloud or fire, either way. No amount of evidence was sufficient to dissuade them from their convictions in the matter. And no outcome was sufficient to change their view of things. Whether God himself intervened and proved the matter or not, they still blame Moses. Isn't that an interesting observation? So the question that arises in circumstances is, why is that the case? We have similar situations as a student and mentor. And you look at what's going on and you think, so a mentor's patience is interpreted by a student as, he hasn't done enough for me. And if the mentor really does intervene, will you try to dictate to me how to think? I mean, is there a safe place? You try one thing, you try another, you hope that at some point a light will go on, and something will happen. there is no a priori guarantee that any one intervention, however well intentioned, is going to have that outcome. And this is true with students, with younger people, as well as older people. When we are determined to see things a certain way, we can always find a justification for continuing in our viewpoint, no matter what evidence is there to contradict it. And that is the frightening thing. If I recall a passage from the first chapter in Patriarchs and Prophets, it talks about how Jesus tried to counsel Lucifer while there was still an opportunity for him to avoid the, shall we say, the ultimate downfall. And all the kindness and courtesy and care with which Christ tried to counsel with him, Lucifer interpreted as weakness. This whole thing doesn't add up too much. I can really prove that I'm strong enough to accomplish what I aim to accomplish. It is fascinating how things can be interpreted when one is willing to interpret them a certain way.
You see this kind of thing in the history of Elijah. He's just done a demonstration that the Lord is God, that the people accepted, and Jezebel's reaction is not to say, oh, you had it right. It is to say, no, you're going to be dead man by tomorrow.
By definition,
right? And the same thing is true of Jesus and his resurrection. The temple guard, it was probably the temple guard, not actually Roman soldiers that made the guard to the tomb, because they reported to the high priest. And there was such a thing as temple guard, and that's why when Pilate said something that can be interpreted both ways, it's probably best interpreted. You have a guard, make it safe as you can. So the temple guard comes back to them. Even if it was Roman soldiers, somebody came to them and said, look, this is what happened. And the high priest, instead of saying, oh no, rebuked it, he really is the Messiah, they go, listen, just tell everybody the disciples came and stole the body. You know, you're just going, obviously, these people are not about to let a few facts get in the way of their theory. And if there's anything that science has to say, it is that you better let the facts get in the way of your theory.
That's right. That's the truth.
Otherwise, you won't find the right theory.
Yeah. So what proof is that?
Just a minute, let's get your comment, because I can't hear. I'm not quite as good hearing as I used to be, so.
So the basis of that statement is science of need of God. Is one of the beliefs in science. If it's fact-based, can we ever prove or disprove his existence?
If we wish to continue learning.
So if it's observation-based, then we operate in, well, I at least operate on the perception that we don't seek to understand it, but we can never fully understand